The hall was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a projector warming up in the corner. Wooden chairs scraped against the concrete floor as German generals filed in, their uniforms still pressed despite months in captivity. They came expecting another lecture, perhaps another round of interrogation disguised as dialogue. What they didn't expect, what they couldn't possibly have prepared for, was color. When the projector finally clicked to life, the room transformed. A beam of light cut through the darkness, and suddenly the gray walls were washed in vivid, impossible hues. Red so bright they seemed to pulse. Blues deeper than any propaganda poster had dared to print. And there, on the makeshift screen, America unfolded before them not as they had been told it would be, but as it actually was. Families spread picnic blankets in parks that stretched for acres. Children laughed, their cheeks flushed with health, not hunger. City streets teemed with automobiles, hundreds of them gleaming under streetlights that hadn't been dimmed by blackout orders. Supermarkets overflowed with goods stacked so high they seemed like monuments to excess. Mountains of fruit. Rows of canned goods. Meat hanging in abundance behind glass cases. The generals sat motionless. Some leaned forward, squinting as if the images might dissolve under scrutiny. Others sank back, their faces unreadable masks hiding the tremors of disbelief. One officer's hand, resting on the armrest, began to tremble. Another's jaw tightened, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. These were men who had commanded armies. Who had sent thousands into battle under the absolute certainty that their cause was just, their enemy weak, their victory inevitable. They had been told America was on the brink of collapse, a nation torn apart by racial strife, crippled by economic decay, too soft and decadent to sustain a war effort. But the screen didn't lie. And in that moment, as color flooded the room, something inside these hardened officers began to crack. The question hanging in the air wasn't just about propaganda anymore. It was about everything they had believed, everything they had fought for, and the dawning, terrible realization that they might have been wrong all along. To understand the shock that gripped those generals, you have to go back to the Germany they grew up in, the one that shaped them long before the war began. The Reich didn't simply ask its officers to believe in victory. It constructed an entire reality, a parallel world where Germany was the pinnacle of civilization and everyone else was either inferior or doomed. From the earliest days of the Nazi rise to power, propaganda became a weapon as potent as any tank or bomber. Joseph Goebbels understood something fundamental about human nature: people believe what they hear most often, especially when it confirms what they want to be true. And so the message was repeated, refined, and hammered into the consciousness of an entire generation. America, they were told, was a dying giant. A country built on the backs of slaves and immigrants, fractured by racial hatred, held together only by the illusion of prosperity. The Great Depression had exposed the rot at its core, the propaganda insisted. Unemployment ravaged its cities. Breadlines stretched for blocks. The nation's industries were rusted relics, incapable of producing the weapons needed for modern warfare. In military academies, young officers absorbed these lessons alongside tactics and strategy. Lectures painted America as a soft, indulgent society where citizens cared more about jazz music and Hollywood movies than sacrifice or discipline. The American soldier, they were assured, lacked the fighting spirit of the German warrior. He would break easily, retreat at the first sign of real resistance. Party-approved newspapers reinforced the narrative daily. Photos were carefully selected, sometimes doctored, to show only the worst of American life: poverty, crime, racial violence. Articles described a nation where Jews secretly controlled the economy, where black Americans were treated worse than animals, where the working class seethed with revolutionary anger. The message was clear: America was too divided, too weak, too corrupt to stand against the Reich. Even German intelligence reports, filtered through the ideological lens of the regime, confirmed what officers wanted to believe. American factories, they claimed, were inefficient. The U.S. military was unprepared, under-equipped, led by politicians rather than warriors. Victory against such an enemy wasn't just possible, it was inevitable. By the time these generals led troops into battle, the propaganda wasn't just something they had heard. It was something they knew, as deeply and instinctively as they knew how to read a map or command a division.
It shaped their decisions, their strategies, their confidence. It made them certain that when America finally entered the war, its participation would be brief and ineffective. But certainty, no matter how deeply rooted, is a fragile thing. And the cracks were about to become impossible to ignore. The surrender came in pieces. Not a single dramatic moment, but a slow collapse as the Reich's once invincible armies found themselves surrounded, outmaneuvered, and cut off from supply lines that no longer existed. For the generals, capture meant different things to different men. Some saw it as a temporary setback, a pause before the inevitable counterattack that would turn the tide. Others felt the cold weight of finality settling on their shoulders but refused to admit it aloud. They arrived at American POW camps expecting brutality. The Geneva Convention was a piece of paper easily torn up by victors with no accountability. They had seen what happened to prisoners in the East, the cruelty that war normalized. They assumed the Americans, despite their surface civility, would be no different. Revenge, after all, was a universal language. Instead, they found something deeply unsettling: order without cruelty, discipline without degradation. The camps designed for high-ranking officers were nothing like the hellscapes they had imagined. Barracks were clean, if Spartan. Meals arrived on schedule, and there was enough food, real food, not the thin gruel of desperation. Guards were firm but rarely harsh, enforcing rules without the sadistic pleasure that had defined so many camps across Europe. For men who had spent years justifying atrocities with the logic of war's necessities, this restraint was almost offensive. It suggested a kind of strength they hadn't anticipated, the strength to show mercy not because you had to, but because you chose to. And choice, in the hands of an enemy you'd been taught to despise, was a troubling thing. The generals responded the only way they knew how, by maintaining the illusion of control. They organized themselves into strict hierarchies, mirroring the command structures they had known. They held themselves to rigid standards of conduct, as if by preserving the rituals of military discipline they could preserve the idea that they still mattered, that their surrender was tactical rather than existential. But beneath the surface, tension simmered. Conversations in the barracks circled endlessly around the same questions. How long before Germany launched the counteroffensive? When would the promised wonder weapons turn the war around? Surely the Americans were struggling, their supply lines stretched too thin, their soldiers growing weary. Surely collapse was imminent. Yet the evidence around them told a different story. There were no signs of strain, no hints of desperation. American guards rotated in and out with the ease of men backed by limitless resources. Food never ran short. Medical supplies were abundant. Even the most minor details, the quality of the soap, the availability of writing paper, suggested a nation not just surviving the war but thriving through it. And then came the invitation. A screening. Educational purposes, they were told. It sounded innocuous enough. But something in the way the Americans announced it, the careful neutrality of their tone, set nerves on edge. Whatever was coming, it wasn't going to be routine. Days in the camp followed a rhythm that felt almost surreal in its normalcy. Morning roll call at 7. Breakfast in the mess hall, coffee that was actually hot, bread that wasn't molded, sometimes even eggs. Then the long stretch of hours that needed filling, time that would have been occupied by command decisions and battle reports now reduced to waiting. Some generals buried themselves in books from the camp library, a surprisingly well-stocked collection that included everything from technical manuals to American novels. Others organized lectures, teaching younger officers about tactics and history, clinging to the role of educator even when there were no more battles to plan. A few took up hobbies, chess became a popular obsession, games stretching over days as players analyzed positions with the same intensity they had once devoted to troop movements. But it was the small observations that gnawed at them most persistently. The American guards who showed up for duty every day with clean uniforms, polished boots, and the casual confidence of men who knew their next meal was guaranteed. The trucks that arrived weekly with supplies, never delayed, never rationed. The medical officer who treated a German prisoner's infected wound with the same antibiotics he would use on an American soldier. They noticed the food waste. Not in the sense of deliberate extravagance, but the simple fact that portions were large enough that not everyone finished their plates.
In Germany, in the camps and cities they had left behind, such waste was unthinkable. Every crumb mattered when hunger was a constant companion. Here, leftovers were scraped into bins without a second thought.
The guards, too, were puzzling. They weren't brutalized conscripts forced into service at gunpoint.
They were volunteers, many of them, young men who seemed almost relaxed in their duties.
They made jokes.
They talked about plans for after the war, college on the GI Bill, jobs waiting back home, girls they wrote letters to. There was no desperation in their eyes, no fear that their world was crumbling. And beyond the fence, visible in the distance during exercise periods, life continued untouched.
Small towns where children walked to school. Farms where crops grew undisturbed by artillery fire.
Roads where civilian vehicles moved freely, unimpeded by military convoys or fleeing refugees.
The contrast was impossible to ignore.
Europe was a graveyard.
America was a garden.
And every day inside the wire, that truth pressed a little harder against the walls of ideology that had kept the general's worldview intact. The screening, when it was finally announced, felt less like an event and more like an inevitability.
Something was coming.
Something that would force them to look even more closely at the gap between what they believed and what was real. The announcement came during evening assembly, delivered by an American officer whose tone was carefully neutral.
Select German generals were invited to attend a special screening and educational presentation, he called it.
Attendance was voluntary, but encouraged. The screening would take place in 3 days, at 1900 hours. Formal uniforms were expected.
The reaction in the barracks was immediate and divided. Some officers dismissed it outright as propaganda, a crude attempt to demoralize them with staged footage or outright lies.
"They'll show us actors pretending to be citizens," one general muttered.
"Film sets dressed up as cities. It's psychological warfare, nothing more."
Others were more cautious.
The Americans had been relatively straightforward so far, offering neither false promises nor unnecessary cruelty. Why would they suddenly resort to cheap tricks? And if the footage was genuine, what exactly did the Americans want them to see?
A third group said nothing, but their interest was unmistakable.
Months of captivity had worn down certainty in ways that interrogation never could.
Doubt had begun to creep in through the cracks, small at first, easily dismissed, but persistent. The screening represented a chance to either confirm their suspicions or put them to rest. Either way, the uncertainty would end. As the day approached, tension thickened in the camp. Officers polished their boots with more care than usual, pressed their uniforms until every crease was sharp. It was a matter of pride, of maintaining dignity in front of the enemy. But it was also armor, a way to prepare for whatever psychological assault awaited them. On the evening of the screening, they gathered in formation and marched to the designated hall, a plain wooden building that had been converted into a makeshift theater. Inside, rows of chairs faced a white screen stretched across the far wall. The projector sat on a raised platform in the back, already loaded with reels of film. American officers stood along the walls, watching but not speaking, their expressions carefully blank. The German generals filed in, taking their seats with military precision.
No one spoke.
The air felt heavy, charged with unspoken anticipation. Some stared straight ahead at the blank screen.
Others glanced sideways at their fellow prisoners, searching for reassurance or perhaps just confirmation that they weren't alone in their apprehension.
Then the lights dimmed. The projector hummed to life. And the first frame flickered onto the screen, bursting with a color so vivid it seemed to leap into the room. Whatever they had expected, whatever preparations they had made, nothing could have readied them for what came next. It started with a street scene.
Not a battlefield, not a factory churning out weapons, just a street in a place that could have been any American town.
The camera panned slowly across storefronts with intact windows, sidewalks where women pushed baby carriages, traffic lights cycling through green and yellow and red. And the colors, God, the colors, were almost painful in their intensity. Reds that seemed to bleed off the screen. Blues so deep they made the sky look like polished sapphire. The green of perfectly manicured lawns, the gold of autumn leaves, the brilliant white of a child's ice cream cone melting in the summer sun. The generals sat frozen as the film continued. A supermarket interior, the camera gliding down aisles that seemed to stretch forever. Shelves stocked from floor to ceiling, canned vegetables, fresh fruit piled in pyramids, entire sections dedicated to candy and sweets. A butcher's counter with cuts of beef and pork wrapped in clean white paper, no rationing signs, no empty spaces. A woman in a floral dress selected items without hurry, without fear, dropping them into a cart that was already half full. Then a factory, but not the kind they expected. This wasn't a grim industrial complex with exhausted workers laboring under armed guards. The facility was clean, well-lit, enormous.
Workers operated machinery with casual efficiency, their clothes unstained, their faces free of the hollowed-out exhaustion that marked every German war plant. The camera lingered on rows of bombers in various stages of assembly, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, stretching back until they disappeared into the distance.
And these were just the ones visible in a single frame.
How many more factories were there? How many more bombers rolling off lines like this every single day?
The footage shifted to a military base. Soldiers in training, but their faces were rounded with good health. They laughed between exercises, shared cigarettes during breaks, played baseball in a field that hadn't been cratered by artillery. The mess hall showed tables loaded with food, real food, not thin soup stretched to feed too many mouths.
Steak. Potatoes. Vegetables. Pie for dessert.
The soldiers ate like men who had never known hunger, because they hadn't. A movie theater next, the marquee blazing with lights advertising the latest Hollywood picture.
Crowds lined up for tickets, couples holding hands, children tugging at their parents' sleeves.
Inside, the seats were plush, the popcorn flowed freely, and no one looked over their shoulder for air raid sirens because there weren't any. The war was an ocean away, and here, in this theater, it might as well have been happening on another planet.
More scenes followed in rapid succession. A university campus where students sprawled on grass, studying in the afternoon sun.
A beach where families built sandcastles and swam in water that hadn't been mined or fortified. Cars, endless streams of cars on highways that connected cities still standing, still bustling, still untouched by the fire that had consumed Europe. The generals watched it all in silence.
Some gripped the armrests of their chairs until their knuckles went white.
Others sat perfectly still, their faces unreadable, but their eyes betraying the storm raging behind them. One officer removed his glasses and cleaned them slowly, methodically, as if the problem might be his vision rather than what he was seeing. The projector continued its relentless work, frame after frame after frame, each one more impossible than the last. This wasn't propaganda. Propaganda exaggerated, distorted, lied. But this was too detailed, too casual, too real to be anything but the truth. The camera work was simple, almost documentary in style. No dramatic music, no narrator spinning tales. Just life, unfolding in vivid color. And that was what made it devastating. Because if this was real, if America really looked like this, felt like this, functioned like this, then everything they had been told was a lie. When the lights finally came back on, no one moved. The projector's cooling fan continued to whir softly in the background, but the German generals sat as if carved from stone, still processing what they had just witnessed. The American officers along the walls remained silent, offering no commentary, no explanation. They didn't need to. The footage had spoken for itself. Slowly, mechanically, the prisoners began to file out of the hall. Some walked with their heads down, eyes fixed on the floor. Others stared straight ahead with the blank expression of men in shock. A few whispered urgently to each other, voices too low to make out the words but the tone unmistakable: denial, anger, confusion, all fighting for dominance. Back in the barracks, the debates erupted. A senior general, his face flushed with indignation, slammed his fist on a table. "Staged," he declared. "All of it. Actors and film sets. They think we're fools." Others rallied around him, eager to embrace any explanation that didn't require them to reconsider everything. The footage was too perfect, they argued. Too clean. Real cities had dirt, poverty, suffering. What they had seen was propaganda, just more sophisticated than they had expected. But not everyone was convinced. A quieter group gathered in the corner, speaking in hushed tones. How do you stage a factory that large? One asked. How do you build fake cities with that level of detail? Another pointed out the cars, the sheer number of vehicles on those highways.
You can't fake that many automobiles. The logistics alone would be impossible.
Someone mentioned the food, the abundance in the supermarket, the meals on the military base. We've been here for months, he said carefully.
And we've been fed better than we were in Germany for the last year of the war. The guards eat the same food. Where is the rationing? Where is the collapse they told us was coming?
The room fell silent.
It was one thing to dismiss filmed evidence as trickery.
It was another to ignore what they had experienced firsthand, day after day, since their capture.
The two realities couldn't coexist, and the tension between them was becoming unbearable.
In the days that followed, the camp's atmosphere shifted. Conversations that had once been dominated by talk of eventual German victory grew quieter, more uncertain. Officers who had maintained rigid discipline began to relax, as if the point of maintaining appearances was no longer clear. The screening had planted a seed of doubt, and doubt, once allowed to take root, was nearly impossible to uproot. Secret transcripts from hidden microphones the Americans had planted throughout the camp captured the disintegration in real time. One general, recorded in a moment he thought was private, confessed to a fellow officer, "I keep thinking about those factories. The number of planes they're producing.
If that's real, then we never had a chance. Not from the beginning." His companion was silent for a long time before responding. Then why did they send us to die for a lie? Not every prisoner reached this conclusion immediately.
Some clung to denial until the end, unable or unwilling to accept that they had been deceived. But for many, the screening marked a turning point, the moment when the certainty that had carried them through years of war finally shattered. The enemy they had been told was weak and divided had turned out to be the strongest, most cohesive force on earth.
And if the leadership had lied about that, what else had been a lie?
The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to dispel, impossible to ignore. The war, they were beginning to realize, had been lost long before they surrendered. It had been lost the moment they chose to believe comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. Years later, when historians interviewed surviving German officers about their experience as prisoners of war, many returned to that screening. Some spoke of it with bitterness, describing it as the moment they realized they had been pawns in a game they didn't understand. Others discussed it with a kind of weary resignation, acknowledging that the truth, however painful, was preferable to the fantasy they had been living.
One general, in a memoir published decades after the war, wrote, "We thought we were fighting for civilization. We believed the propaganda that told us our enemies were weak, degenerate, unworthy. But when I saw those images, the factories, the abundance, the strength, I understood that we had never been fighting for civilization. We had been fighting against it." The screening at the POW camp was part of a larger American strategy, one designed not just to contain German officers but to re-educate them. The United States understood something fundamental about ending wars: defeating an army wasn't enough if the ideology that fueled it remained intact. The footage was meant to be undeniable, a confrontation with reality that left no room for interpretation. And it worked, not universally, but enough. The generals who returned to Germany after the war carried with them a changed perspective. Some became advocates for democracy, helping to rebuild a nation that had been destroyed by the very lies they once believed. Others retreated into silence, unable to reconcile the men they had been with the men they had become. But the screening's impact extended beyond individual transformations. It represented a broader truth about the Second World War, that it was fought not just with bullets and bombs, but with information and perception. The Nazis had built their empire on a foundation of propaganda, convincing millions that their cause was just and their victory inevitable. The Allies countered with something simpler and more powerful: reality. The color footage shown in that dim hall wasn't just evidence of American strength. It was proof that truth, when presented undeniably, could crack even the most fortified ideologies. The generals who watched those films had devoted their lives to a vision of the world that was fundamentally false. The screening forced them to confront that falsehood in a way that words alone never could. In the end, the war was lost long before the final battles were fought.
It was lost in the factories that produced more planes than Germany could ever shoot down.
In the fields that grew more food than the Reich could ever blockade.
In the cities that thrived while Europe burned.
And it was lost in the minds of men who, when finally confronted with the truth, had no choice but to admit they had been deceived. The screen went dark.
The projector stopped. But the images remained, burned into memory, impossible to forget.
And in that small, quiet hall, surrounded by the enemy they once thought they understood, the German generals learned the hardest lesson of all: you cannot win a war built on lies, no matter how many people believe them.